Welcome to this accreditation webinar. It's good that we are organizing something towards the end of the year because the accreditation forum is once a year in person in June. And for the rest of the year, we haven't done anything to get in touch with accreditation people around the world. So it's great to see so many of you. We've had 180 people register from all over the world, from China and India to Latin America. I hope Colombia is still okay with the early morning. A few clarifications to start with. I'm doing this 10 to 15 minute presentation on behalf of AMBA and BGA. I'm George Iliev, Accreditation Director at AMBA. And then I'll hand over to Hans, who will present his software. It's a software platform that he has developed that grew out of one of the AMBA accredited schools, the University of Sussex. But it's important to note that using any software, any external software, is not a requirement for AMBA accreditation, AMBA or BGA accreditation. It has never been a requirement. And we also wouldn't know which schools use what software. It's a little bit like whether you prepare your documents with Microsoft Word or with MacBook or with OpenOffice, it doesn't matter. What we look for is the outcome, the ready-made and quality documentation. Now, to start with, for some of you who may not be fully familiar with AMBA and BGA, AMBA and BGA is the new name of the Association of MBAs since 2019. Before that, in the first 20 years of its existence, from 1967 to 1989, the name of the organization was Business Graduates Association, BGA. In 1989, it changed its name to Association of MBAs, AMBA, and that was the name for the next 30 years. And so in 2019, we brought this retired name, BGA, out of retirement, and we added it to AMBA and BGA with a new accreditation system, membership and accreditation. A few statistics. There are 297 AMBA accredited schools worldwide currently, and that's primarily schools with MBA programs where AMBA accredits the MBA portfolio. There are 5 or 6 schools that don't have an MBA but have their Masters in Management accredited by AMBA, and 1 school with a DBA only accreditation. Otherwise, there are probably about 60 of the AMBA schools that have MBAs. They also have MBM accreditation. That's the Masters in Management accreditation for AMBA. And about a dozen have DBA, but that's on top of the MBA portfolio. That's on the AMBA side. On the BGA side, currently there are 53 BGA accredited schools, that including 33 or 4 that are AMBA schools that have both AMBA and BGA accreditation. So they've done both accreditations, and 20 schools that have BGA only accreditation. That is schools that do not have AMBA. And separately from accreditation, BGA also is a membership platform. And currently there are 295 BGA member schools. And again, half of them are AMBA accredited and half of them are BGA only members. I hope that wasn't too confusing. AMBA is traditionally known as a portfolio accreditation in the sense that we accredit the institution with a mandatory master's level management education portfolio. BGA is not a portfolio accreditation, it's an institutional accreditation. So for BGA accreditation, we use 2 sample programs. For AMBA accreditation, we look at every single MBA program that the institution delivers, every single degree program. That is called an MBA or EMBA. I'll pause here with the statistics. I'll talk a little bit about the documentation. So for AMBA accreditation or reaccreditation, there are two important documents. One is the self-assessment forms, which is data tables, and the other is a self-audit report, which is a longer 80-page document that's more of a narrative. The important thing to note is that the self-assessment forms, the SAFs, this is the crucial document, and that document remains part of the accreditation report. It is attached as part of the accreditation report that we produce after an accreditation visit. The self-audit report gets shelved and is never looked at after the 4 assessors have read it for the visit. So if you are in doubt where to put your efforts, it's the self-assessment forms that are the key document. For BGA, it's a similar type of documentation, self-assessment forms for the 2 sample programs, and then a self-audit report. When we do AMBA and BGA accreditation jointly at the currently 30+ institutions that have done it, the school does not need to produce a BGA self-audit report because it already has produced the AMBA self-audit report, and that covers most of the information that we need for the institution. Separately, for BGA accreditation, there is also something called continuous impact model, which is a table that tells us how your institution is impacting society, business, and the world at large. SIM is quite an interesting, we called it CIM, SIM. It's quite an interesting addition to the accreditation documentation, because before, five years ago, we did not have any requirement for reporting how you have impact. We would discuss it in conversations during the visit, but now we want to see it written down, and it's a bit of a struggle, to be honest, for schools to produce impactful metrics that can convey their impact. I'll give you 5 examples of metrics that I've liked, that I've seen around the world at schools in the SIM document prepared by schools. Because often half of the metrics that institutions pick are not really showing impact. For example, academic publications. Well, that's good for the academic world, but in business and society, peer-reviewed journal 4-star academic publications don't really move the needle. But the 5 examples I would like to give you are: how many of your faculty at your institution, how many of your professors engage in consultancy for at least 15% of their time? And the typical example would be if the institution has a consultancy Friday policy, where professors have their Fridays off from teaching and research expectations, and they can dedicate their Fridays to consulting work with companies, with industry. That's one. How many of your professors, faculty, sit on boards that are not university, not your own institution's boards, but company boards, non-profit boards, community or whatever, sports, arts, councils and boards? That's the second one. Third one, about students. How many company visits do you take your students to in the last 12 months? And that's really impactful, because students learn from practice as well as from theory. So even live cases in the classroom are not as impactful as taking the students to a company and hearing a manager from the company speak. Number 4, the recency of the case studies used. So what percentage of the case studies are from the last 3 years, for example? And professors often push back on this, because they say, oh, I use this iconic case study from the 1960s. It teaches the students everything they need to know about managerial accounting or whatever. But students actually are not taking a history class, and the same concepts from that iconic 1960s case study can be taught with a 2022 case study about Apple, Google, NVIDIA, you name it. Something that rings a bell to the student and conveys relevance. And lastly, what percentage of your alumni are go pursue an entrepreneurial career after graduation? How many of them start their own startup? So these are my 5 personally favorite metrics of impact. Perhaps in 2 minutes, I can tell you about key shortcomings that we see in the self-assessment forms around the world. We want to see every single MBA program or EMBA program for AMBA accreditation listed in the SAF. And that means also different locations, different modes of delivery. We consider these separate programs. Sometimes schools think that if the curriculum is the same, then then this is a single program, whether it's delivered in Cape Town or London or Dubai. But to AMBA, it's 3 different programs. If it's 3 locations, because it's based on the student experience. Is the cohort experience of the students that are taking this program different? Yes, well, then that's a separate program, and it has to be reported as a separate program. Secondly, carousel delivery, where courses overlap and students from different programs can take courses jointly. We can review this model on a case-by-case basis to determine whether at some point, if the students overlap for more than 50% of their courses, then if we could consider this a single program rather than multiple programs with that touch base at some point. But that's a case-by-case decision, and you should discuss it with the accreditation director who is responsible for your school. For some parts of the world, that's me. For other parts of the world, that's my colleagues Mark Stoddard and Catherine O'Flynn. And lastly, a GDPR data protection violation if schools include names of students or faculty in the data tables, in the self-assessment forms. It really, we have to, when we see this, we have to come back to you and ask you to anonymize or pseudonymize the name, the tables, because otherwise we cannot use them, because we're not supposed to see sheets of names. However, it's important to the term technically is pseudonymize, because when you replace the student names with a number, if we have a particular question about a particular student or a particular professor, then we should be able to come to you and you would know who that person is and give us their information. I'll pause here and hand over to Hans, and then we're open to any questions. Thank you very much. Hans, over to you.
Thank you very much, George. Yes, good morning also from my side. And other time zones are obviously available, so good evening and good afternoon to some of you. We've had an overwhelming response to this seminar, so really pleased about that. And yeah, so the second part of this seminar is really just to talk about some of the software that is available. As George was already saying, this is optional, but it is something that that could be useful, especially if you have multiple accreditations. So not just AMBA BGA, but also some of the others. Okay. yeah, so just by way of brief introduction, I'm Hans van der Heijden. I'm a company director of a software company, H2 Software Limited. And I'm also a part-time professor at the University of Sussex. Let me just go quickly to the software product that we produce. It's called Accredinator. It launched in 2021 at the University of Sussex, where I was in charge of EQUIS accreditation at the time. And what it does is it features one database, but it services multiple accreditations. So obviously we service AMBA and BGA, but once you have the data in place, you're also able to produce fully compliant reports for EQUIS, for AACSB, for AABS, which is the African Association for Business Schools, and Prime as well. And we are hoping or planning to introduce Financial Times forums in the next year, Q1. And that's really for those schools who want their degrees ranked by the Financial Times. We currently have about 40 customers around the world. Mostly in English-speaking countries, but also elsewhere. We've got them in Europe, mainland Europe, US, Canada, and Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. So used pretty much all over the world. We have a few strategic partnerships. Of course, we have one strategic partnership with AMBA BGA, which we value very much, and of course one with QED accreditation consultants, and they do a lot of marketing and thought leadership for us in the accreditation world. Sikander, before I move on, perhaps it's good to have a few questions that we have prepared just to ask the participants. Are you happy to load up the first question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I see a question about the SAF versus SAR. The SAR does matter, but it's not. Oh, sorry. Is that a poll?
George, yeah. So this is actually the questions that I prepared for.
Oh, right. Okay. I'll answer the questions afterwards. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that fine? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So this is the first question. So it just says I can't vote, which is a shame. But anyway, we were just interested in your current situation with regards to AMBA. So are you just looking? Are you actively pursuing AMBA at the moment, or are you currently holding the AMBA accreditation? So Sikander, I can't really see any responses coming in. Can you see that?
Yeah, yes, I can see the responses on my end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you able to show them to us?
Bear with me.
Sikander, are you still there?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to get a way to share this poll. Share results. There we go. How about now?
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Okay, so there's there's about, I'm not sure if everybody else can see that, but yeah, so 17% just looking, 15% pursuing, actively pursuing, and 68 currently holding. Fantastic. Okay, let's go for the next poll then, question, which is the same question, but then it's about BGA.
Bear with me. Uh, okay, second one's launched.
Yeah. So the same question, but then for BGA, I'll just give everybody a chance to answer that question. So Sikander, do you want to share the results now?
Yeah, absolutely. There we are.
Yeah. Okay, that tallies with the statistics, George, that you've mentioned. So more schools are just looking for BGA, and okay, some of you are currently holding that. Fantastic. And then let's go for the last question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the last question is about software support. So there's a couple of ways that schools can do this. So do you just pick and mix from your existing systems? Do you do that, but also use a lot of extra Excel? Do you use some dedicated software, such as the one I was just going to present a bit later, or nothing at all? I'm not sure this is an anonymous poll, but we'll see. Iskander, yep, very good. So yeah, that's interesting. So a lot of Excel and a lot of extra, processing from your existing systems. Fantastic. Yeah. Fantastic. And a few who make it all up, indeed. All right, let's just move on. I'll show you a bit about the software that we produce for AMBA and BGA. The first thing we wanted to do was to make it as user-friendly as possible. And to do that, we follow the so-called three-click principle. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that principle, but it basically means that you should really be able to get to anything you want from the homepage in 3 clicks. If it takes longer than 3 clicks, then clearly we've done it wrong. We have not designed it very well. So what you can see here, top left, is the home screen of our software. You can see that there's a single data module entry where you can enter your data, and then we've got a couple more extra modules. And at the bottom right of that top left screen, we've got the accreditation. So you can basically choose each of these accreditations and go in there, and that's your first click. So I've just clicked on, or in this screenshot, let's just assume we've clicked on the BGA module, and then top right, you can see the module. You can see there the forms that we have, the compliant forms we have for BGA. And then you click on one that says continuous improvement, the full report. So we get there the full report, and that's bottom left. That's the full report. I'll discuss that in a bit more detail a bit later. And then what you do is the third click is you export that to Word, and then bottom right is your Word document. So basically, you can have a look at what it would look like in the system. And then if you're happy with that, you can export it to Word and send it to George or one of his colleagues. So that's the three-click principle. That's something that we really wanted to do for pretty much every single report that you have in the system. For those of you who are worried that this is going to be another sort of really big system with lots of data and a long period of implementation, don't worry. It's seldom like that, to be honest. It only really takes a few weeks to get it in the system. We really rely on a lot of data from other systems as well, because we know many schools already have a lot of systems in place. They really don't need another one. So for example, for the faculty, we use the HR system. The HR system obviously produces a couple of spreadsheets for faculty, which we can import. You can, if you want, also take data from ORCID. Not every school does that, but I know there are quite a few schools who are looking at the ORCID data just to collect publications, for example, for their faculty and so on. Most schools will have a so-called research information system. I mean, players like Pure and Elements and so on. And we take information from there as well, in particular around the publications side. And we also interface with a couple of other more dedicated systems, including the Hive Impact Tracker. Some of you might have that software, and that's basically to record research impact. So we take data from Hive and put it into Accredinator for the accreditation report on impact. So that's how that works. Most of the integration is done via spreadsheets, because that's what schools are most familiar with. Okay, I was just going to show you a couple of reports from BGA in particular. I'll focus actually on the SIM. George was already discussing the continuous impact model, where we provide full support for it. For the full report, we've got an abridged report as well. That's for schools who are fast tracking into BGA through AMBA. We've got a metric summary, and we also have a metric analyzer that just keeps track of the things that you need to do for the SIM model. We also provide software for the SAF, the self-assessment form, the one that George said was so very important. So we've got that. We've got one for the programs, and we also have one for faculty and for publications. I'm not actually showing that because it's a little bit boring, but we definitely have that. And in fact, we also have that for AMBA as well. So yeah, that's the type of thing that we support. Okay, so the SIM model, for those who are just looking into the BGA and have never seen this before, so this is what it looks like. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements. And the idea is that you produce metrics for at least 5 of these dimensions, they call them, don't they, George? So there are 6 dimensions, and you need to choose 5 of them. And then for each of these dimensions, you need to choose 2 metrics. So yeah, so those are the ones that you have to choose. And George has already given you a couple of examples for some of these dimensions. So for every metric, you have to provide a 3-year table where you basically say, this is what we would like it to be, and this is where we currently are. So in that sense, it's not actually that different from assurance of learning. So in assurance of learning, you basically measure something, and if you're not happy with it, you put up an improvement, and then after the improvement, you measure it again. So closing the loop. So you're saying, okay, have we done it? Have we done what we wanted to do? And are we where we need to be? And it's in a way, it works very similar, but then much more strategic with strategic KPIs. So you say, this is a sort of KPI that we're trying to target, and how are we going to get there in the next 2 or 3 years? So here, what you can see is how schools have reported. This is an example of reports where you basically take a metric, a SIM dimension and a metric, and you say, this is the input, this is the activity, output, outcome, and impact. And so that's the full report. There's also an abridged report for those who are fast tracking into BGA, and we have support for that as well. Okay, so here you can see an example of the software. The way it works is, yeah, we repurpose it a bit from the sort of strategic KPI data that we have in our system, which we also use for AACSB Standard 1, AACSB Standard 2, and AACSB Standard 9. And so the idea is basically you put that data in once, and then you repurpose it for different accreditations. So for BGA in particular, every strategic initiative has a couple of metrics, and those metrics are then ported into the reports for BGA. You can see here how that works. You can add SDGs, because that's also required. And you can say a few words about the targets of these metrics. Okay, that's one. Yeah, we'd also then have the full report. And what you see here is a table, and every row is essentially, we call it a school initiative. So or an intervention, if you like. So you say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and this is the outcome, and this is how it impacts the KPI. So here we follow very, very, very closely the BGA reporting formats. Basically, just to make sure that we're fully compliant with whatever BGA and AMBA come up with. Okay, this is the abridged report that I was talking about. So this type of report you need to do for every metric. So there will be 10 of those, because you'll have at least 10 metrics. There will be 10 of these reports, or you have one table with 10 of these metrics, where you basically just combine that all a little bit, and you say, okay, this is for every, basically one metric for every row, one row for every metric, where you just condense it a bit and say, rather than just one table for one metric, we're just going to put all of that in one single table. So we provide that as well, and that's also compliant with BGA, AMBA BGA. If you are not sure whether you need to put up a bridge report or a full report, always discuss with your accreditation director, because he or she will be able to tell you. Okay, what else do we have? So we've got, what I've put up here is actually some metric guidelines. This is not me saying that. This is basically, this comes from AMBA BGA, and what you see here is, no more than 10 impact metrics, and 3 of the 10 should directly and explicitly reference the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, I'm sure familiar to most of you. And so ideally you would have 2 metrics per dimension and so on. So just to make sure that that's covered, we also have something which we call a metric analyzer, where it just really quickly says, okay, do you meet those requirements? So do you have no more than 10 metrics? Do you have at least 5 dimensions covered by these metrics? And how many, or do you have at least 3 metrics that reference the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? And the software will just take care of that, keep track of that and see if you're doing a good job or not. And I will fully admit that this is not rocket science, and this is something you could easily do on your own. However, feedback from AMBA BGA suggests that they do get a lot of BGA reports where these rules are not met, and then they have to go back to the school and say, hey, that's not what we agreed. We do need to reference those SDGs, or you do have to cover all these dimensions and so on. So even though it may not sound like rocket science, it's really good just to keep track of all these things, just to make sure that before you send it to AMBA BGA, you adhere to the guidelines that they have suggested. Yeah, so I wanted to say a brief word about the benefits of software, really, as opposed to Excel. The big advantages, of course, is that you can repurpose some of this data. So as I was mentioning before, the metric data, the KPI data, the strategy data, all of that can be repurposed to other accreditations. So I have here as examples, I've put up AACSB Table 1 and AACSB Table 2. And actually also a report from the AABS, that's the African Association for Business Schools. So you can see here, a lot of that data is just repurposed for different standards. And that can be super, super efficient, especially if you deal with a lot of accreditations. And there are many schools who have a lot of accreditations, and they think, yeah, we kind of collected that data already. So, can we repurpose it to for this next accreditation? And the beauty of this is, of course, that that's fully possible. So if you've got AACSB, for example, it really isn't that much work to get the data for BGA in shape, for example. I mean, it's really, really quick to do because you've got the data in the database already. So that's the repurpose advantage. And then finally, I wanted to say something about software and deadlines. So this is, if you like, the golden scenario. So we've got a deadline. Say, for example, we need to produce the BGA self-assessment form. So, first we generate the tables, then we write the draft chapters, because you can't really draft a narrative if you don't have the table. So that always comes first. And then you discuss and reflect amongst your team to say, okay, what are we going to do with those chapters? And then you finish your chapters, and then there's time for cocktails. Basically, that's the idea. And then there's the deadline, and you comfortably meet the deadline, and everybody's happy. So that's the happy scenario. And if your school is like this, then congratulations, and that's wonderful, because that's exactly how it needs to be. But what I have also seen, of course, is that there are some other schools who take far too long to generate those tables, and they really have no time to reflect on any of that. So as soon as the tables are ready, they need to write the narrative for these things, and the deadline then comes along very quickly, and you have always that feeling that you think, yeah, we could have done a lot better, but this is just what it is. It just took too long to get that data ready. And if you're that type of school, I think that's also fine, and that's perhaps a bit more realistic for some schools. Of course, what you also can have is a school where it just takes far too long to generate any of these tables. You don't meet the deadlines. You have to phone up George and say, George, can we have an extension, because it's not going to work? And so, that's really where the benefit of software is, I think, the clearest, especially if you have multiple accreditations and no time for cocktails, which is terrible. Very good. I'll leave it there, and let's see if there's any questions.
So I see half of the questions are on the software, half of the questions are about accreditation.
Okay.
I'll start with the first two, and then you carry on, Hans, with the next.
Sure.
So the difference between the SAF and the SAR, the SAR will only get read by the 4 assessors in order to get the background information for the visit. But the SAF contains the crucial numbers. And so the SAF is the document that we read first as assessors on a panel. Then we read the self-audit report, the SAR. But the SAF is attached to the accreditation report, so then it will be also reviewed by our International Accreditation Advisory Board as part of the endorsement process of the panel's recommendation for accreditation. And from that perspective, the SAF is the more important document. For the SAR, a few perhaps guidelines. So 80 pages in length, and everything else can be put in appendices. And in these 80 pages, the information should still be structured sufficiently to make it easier to read. And what that means is numbered lists, bullet points, tables, graphs, not just a wall of text. And the 80 pages, that is actually harder than you think, because when you're collecting information from different depositories, from different people, and they give you 20 pages each, you have to make it shorter. You may remember this quote by Mark Twain. I apologize for this long letter. I didn't have time to make it shorter. Actually, 80 pages is harder to produce than 200 pages for pretty much any institution that we deal with. That's on the first question. The second question on AMBA alone or BGA first. So AMBA is currently closed to new applicants because our board of trustees has mandated a cap of 300 that is pretty much has been reached. This means that BGA accreditation is open. So any institution that wants to, any association with AMBA and BGA has to start with BGA. Membership is the first step, but membership is a one-page form that your dean signs, and the school becomes a member. But then the accreditation, BGA accreditation, depending on how good your data is, can take up to 3 years, and you get appointed a mentor. And I believe one of the mentors, Professor Philip McLaughlin, in France, he's on this webinar as well. I hope he is. So your mentor guides you through documentation process and your readiness to proceed to the accreditation visit for BGA. For AMBA currently, the only small exception that we can make to allow an institution to go forward is if the school already has ACSB and EQUIS, so they're missing AMBA to become a triple accredited school. And there are a few dozen schools around the world that are still missing AMBA and are dual accredited, ACSB and EQUIS, not any EFMD accreditation, it has to be EQUIS, or the leading business school in a country where AMBA has not yet accredited any institutions. And we're thinking more, this is for emerging markets where EQUIS and ACSB are not as common. So perhaps Ghana, Kenya, Vietnam, the Philippines. I can't think of any other countries where there are currently no AMBA accredited schools. And again, that has to be the leading institution in that country. I hope this answered your question on the sequence. BGA first, AMBA at some point by invitation, and if our board relaxes the 300 schools limit, which we expect will happen at some point, but this year, at least by the end of the year, the limit remains at 300. Hans, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, George. Let me just quickly check. I'm not sure if everybody else can see those questions, so I'm just going to repeat them as I answer them. There's one question that says, who owns the data? That's very simple. You own the data. So the school always owns the data. We are basically the data processor in GDPR terms. So we don't own the data. You own the data. Then there's a question here that says, what happens if BGA or AMBA updates the tables, which they do from time to time? Does that mean that you need to pay more to get the updates? The answer is no. We keep our software fully up to date, and every time an accreditation body changes their reporting requirements, we change as well, and we change as fast as we can. And sometimes it takes a bit longer, but in the end, we'll always, produce compliant reports for whatever the current standard is at the time. For ACSB, they've got a fairly sort of straightforward or annual, they call it clarification round. So in July, there's a clarification round for their standards. EQUIS is slightly trickier. It's somewhere between June, July that they come with their new requirements, and AMBA BGA tends to introduce their new requirements at the annual accreditation forum, which was this year in Prague. I think it was end of May. So every year around end of May, you get some of the new requirements for AMBA and BGA. Yeah, something about pricing here. So if you are interested, just get in touch with us. We offer what we call a foundations version, which is very, entry-level pricing, I would say affordable. And then there we also have a pro version that offers you a bit more functionality, which I think is still affordable. But yeah, that's just please get in touch with us and we can discuss these things. We also, there's a question here about EFMD's business school impact system. Not at the, not specifically, although there are certainly a lot of reports that we produce that can be used and have been used for the BSIS system that EFMD that EFMD handles. So it can be used, although we don't have any specific support for that. There's a question here about the analyzing part. Is this available for other accreditations also? The answer is yes. So we do offer quite a lot of, we call them data quality issues. So as soon as we see a data quality issue in the system, we actually report that. And you can actually go through each of the issues that the system comes up with as to say, okay, you know, for example, this faculty doesn't have a discipline, or this faculty, you know, doesn't have a position that's live in the self-assessment period, etc., etc. How long has the software been in use? So yeah, like I said, it's fairly new software. It's been in use since 2021. So we are now operating for the, we're entering our 4th year now. I think that covers most of it. Yeah.
Shall I answer 2 more questions?
Yeah, sure.
One is about AMBA versus BGA again. Let me get this on my screen. So do we have to do BGA if we want to get AMBA? You don't have to, but AMBA for an initial applicant without Accreditation is currently not open for applications. It may change in the future. BGA is open. So if you want to start somewhere, better start somewhere. And that's BGA. The second part of the question, they're not really connected, are they? Well, they are. I would say there is about a 75% overlap between what AMBA focuses on and what BGA focuses on. Institutionally, it's pretty much, well, say 90% overlapping. Of course, then the program portfolio differs. AMBA is always the MBA portfolio. BGA can be, and we typically recommend 1 master's, 1 undergraduate program. But again, the master's can be the MBA, so that's another overlap. AMBA overlaps even with external accreditations to us, like EQUIS or ACSB. And you'd be surprised from an assessor's perspective how much of the, well, probably you wouldn't be surprised, because you prepare the documentation and you know that you can repurpose an ACSB document or an EQUIS document for AMBA and the other way around. But from an assessor perspective as well, we see how the same blocks are being used, because, for example, assurance of learning, AMBA has requirements on learning goals. It's just a slightly different term as opposed to intended learning outcomes, what ACSB uses. And the last part of the question, it seems odd. I hope I answered it so it's no longer odd. But if you have any concrete questions, the best person to talk to is your accreditation director, who may be me, my colleague Catherine, or my colleague Mark. And I can put up on the screen a map of the world, so you can see who to talk to for AMBA or BGA. Actually, for BGA alone, my colleague Mark Stoddard deals with initial BGA non-AMBA accredited institutions that go for BGA. For the world, except for China, I'm responsible for BGA in China. But for AMBA, we are split 3 ways. Let me see if I can share my screen with that map. And I hope this will be clearer. So if you're from Spain, London and the Midlands, Central and Eastern Europe mostly, East Asia, Latin America, you talk to me. If your school is based in France, Germany, Africa, Middle East, India, and North America, you talk to Mark. And if your school is in Northern Europe, Ireland, Scotland, Northern England, and parts of Southern England and Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, you talk to Catherine. I'll leave this for a moment. And the second question was, will there be an update in 2025? No, we are not planning any changes to the accreditation criteria. The last update was in 2022, and that's for 5 years. So the next one will be in 2027. In the meantime, we may come up with clarifications on or guidance on or things that we see that are happening around the world that schools may be doing not as expected, and we can say no, this is to be interpreted like this, but no major changes in the criteria for the next 2.5 years. One piece of guidance related to the self-assessment forms is new programs, new MBA programs at AMBA accredited schools that are launched mid-cycle, say in between 2 accreditation visits. They have to be submitted for review and approval by our International Accreditation Advisory Board, typically 6 to 9 months before the launch of the program, so that if there is any feedback, especially on curriculum, that can be implemented in the new program. And sometimes it happens that schools either launch a new program and don't tell us, and then we have to reprimand them and review it after it's been launched, and that's tricky, because if changes are required, then students are already studying, so it can be a sensitive negotiation between the program directors and their own students, if any major change needs to be made. And the other thing that has sometimes happened is schools will report AMBA collects AMBA and BGA, but it's for AMBA schools only currently. We collect annual intake and enrollment and applications and enrollment statistics for the MBA programs. This is done by colleagues of ours who are not part of the accreditation team. And so they're from the research and PR team. So we don't see that data, and sometimes schools will tell us, well, look, we submitted our data for this new program to your colleague Ellen. Typically it's Ellen who sends the surveys. So we've done our duty in terms of reporting. It doesn't work like this. It has to be a program self-assessment form submitted for the new program to your respective accreditation director, and it has to be reviewed by our International Accreditation Advisory Board, and then you receive notification of its approval, and then it gets added to the AMBA website, to the list of MBA programs that are listed on the under your school's account on the AMBA website. Just submitting one number for a new program for our annual enrollments survey does not cover the accreditation obligations of your institution. Hans, back to you.
Yeah, so there's a, I mean, we're almost at the end. I'm just looking here to see there's a question about the BSIS certification. So I think the best person to answer those questions is your EQUIS sort of contact person, really. It's, I mean, I don't think it would be right for me to say too much about that, and just discuss it with your AMBA BGA accreditation director to see how much of that you can repurpose. I'm sure there's quite a bit that you can repurpose for it, but I would just advise you to just talk to your AMBA BGA accreditation director to see you know, what you can do with that. Okay, there's some good feedback on the tables versus deadline slide. I'm glad you like that, and yes, of course, you're quite that's quite okay to share that. If you just reference that you got it from Accredinator, that would be appreciated. There's also a question here on sort of accreditations in general, sort of people asking, you know, how close is EQUIS to AACSB and so on. those are really sort of the things that I would just advise you to just either attend a seminar from one of these accreditation bodies, and then you can just, you know, it will be very easy to see for yourself how close they are or not. My own experience is that they seem close at the surface level, but then when you go a bit deeper, then you can definitely see that there are different accents for different accreditation bodies. AMBA BGA, for example, you can clearly see, you know, the sort of business experience coming through that you don't really have with the other accreditation bodies. And then finally, the last question, does AMBA apply to any master program, or is it exclusively to MBA?
Let me take that.
Yeah, why don't you take that, George?
So institutions that deliver MBA programs have to submit all their MBA programs for review by AMBA. That's the rule. It's the entire portfolio. However, for institutions that do not have an MBA, they can submit, and there are 6 currently schools that have MBM type programs, Master in Management, MIM, Master in International Management. So they are, so AMBA can review the Masters in Management for pre-experienced students if there is no MBA at the school. Now, this is also an optional accreditation for MBM accreditation is optional for schools that have the AMBA MBA accreditation, and about 50 to 60 schools in the world have that. Which means you can tell your students you're AMBA accredited, your MBA students you're AMBA accredited, but your master's students as well, their program can be AMBA accredited. And then DBA, Doctorate in Business Administration, at a dozen institutions around the world that have AMBA for the MBA portfolio. One point about the metrics that Hans was showing for the SIM, continuous impact model. Sometimes they can be very inward facing. For example, the metric you showed, Hans, was revenue from tuition. And that's probably the MBA director's target or the dean's target, but it does not show impact. And typically, a good impact metric is one that already shows you impact in the title. So there was one saving grace for that metric, which was in brackets percentage reinvested. And that reinvested is actually a better metric. How much of the revenue is reinvested in improving the program, in curriculum development, in faculty development, etc. That's a much better metric than just a pure how much money my institution makes from tuition fees.
That makes sense.
Hans, back to that's not criticism of the. It's actually, it shows, it's a good example how difficult these things are to pick the right metric, given that there are hundreds of possible metrics that an institution juggles with.
Thank you, George. I think, Iskander, we've sort of reached, well, first, definitely our time limit, but also sort of we can wrap up the questions, I think, as we've covered most of them.
Yeah. I mean, if you're both happy with everything, I think we can conclude it there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And see you in person at the next accreditation forum in June, somewhere in Europe, or at the AMBA and BGA conferences.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you once again to our partner Accredinator and our speakers for such a fascinating insight. Thank you all for joining us today and for your brilliant questions and interactions. I hope you enjoyed the session as much as I did. If you missed anything, don't worry, because we are recording this and slides will be available in the post-event comms and on our website. So thank you once again for everyone, and goodbye.